Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. This happened a few years ago, when I was still living in Austin, Texas. I was in my early 20s, renting this little one-bedroom house just outside the city. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was quiet and felt safe enough. I was living alone for the first time, which was exciting, but also kind of scary sometimes. It was a Saturday night, and I had no plans. I remember it clearly because I was just binge-watching some Netflix and eating leftover pizza. It was one of those nights where you're just happy to be home, doing nothing. I didn't even bother turning on the lights in the rest of the house. The glow from the TV was all I needed. Around 9:30 p.m., there was a knock at my front door. I froze for a second because I wasn't expecting anyone, and I didn't even hear a car pull up or anything. My driveway is right outside the window, so I should have seen or heard someone arrive. I paused my show and just sat there, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. I got up and peeked through the peephole. It was a woman. She looked to be in her 30s, maybe early 40s. She had dark hair tied back in a ponytail and was wearing a hoodie and jeans. She didn't look threatening or anything, but something about her felt off. She noticed me looking through the peephole and said, "Hi, sorry to bother you, but I'm your neighbor. My phone died and I just need to borrow yours real quick to call someone. It's kind of an emergency." Now, I've lived in this house for about a year and I know all my neighbors, at least by sight. I had never seen this woman before. That made me hesitate, but at the same time, I didn't want to seem rude. What if she really was in trouble? So I opened the door a crack, leaving the chain on, and said, I'm sorry, I don't think I know you. Which house do you live in?" She smiled, too wide like she was trying too hard, and said, "Oh, I just moved in 2 houses down. I'm so sorry to bother you. I just need to call my husband. Please, it'll only take a minute." I should have trusted my gut right then, but I didn't. Something about her smile made my skin crawl, but I didn't want to be the person who refused to help someone in need. So I unlatched the chain and opened the door. She stepped inside quickly, like she'd been waiting for me to say that. I remembered immediately regretting it. She didn't look around like most people do when they walk into a new place. They glance at the furniture, maybe comment on something. She just stood there in the doorway for a second, like she was sizing up the room. Her hands were shoved deep into the front pocket of her hoodie, and I noticed she kept glancing back toward the door, like she was expecting someone. I tried to break the tension by saying, "You can use my phone. It's right here." I motioned to where my phone was sitting on the coffee table. She didn't move at first, just stood there like she was thinking about something, and then she nodded. "Thanks," she said, but she didn't take her hands out of her hoodie. She walked over to the coffee table slowly, like she was stalling. My heart was starting to race because I couldn't figure out what was wrong, but I knew something wasn't right. When she reached the coffee table, she didn't pick up my phone. Instead, she turned around to face me, and I'll never forget the look on her face. The fake friendliness was gone, and her eyes were cold and hard. She pulled a knife out of her hoodie pocket, one of those big ones that fold out, and held it up between us. "Sit down," she said, her voice completely different now, calm and steady. I backed up a step, holding my hands up. "Hey, take it easy," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "You don't have to do this. If you need money, I can give you money." My mind was racing. I was alone in the house, no neighbors close enough to hear me scream, and my phone was on the table, completely out of reach. She didn't respond to what I said, just nodded toward the couch. "Sit down," she repeated. I sat down, my heart pounding so hard I thought she'd hear it. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this. She stood there for a second, just watching me, and then she started moving toward the front door. She opened it and gave a quick wave, like she was signaling someone outside. That's when I realized she wasn't alone. I heard footsteps coming up the porch, heavy and fast. I didn't wait to see who it was. I jumped up from the couch and bolted toward the back of the house. I could hear her yell, "Get him!" as I ran, but I didn't look back. I sprinted to the kitchen, unlocked the back door, and flung it open. I didn't even stop to grab my shoes. I just ran out into the backyard and climbed over the fence into my neighbor's yard. I kept running, my feet hitting the cold dirt and gravel, until I reached the street. I could hear voices shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran straight to the closest house with the lights on and started banging on the door, yelling for help. Thankfully, an older couple lived there, and they let me in. The husband called the police while his wife tried to calm me down. When the cops showed up, they searched my house but didn't find anyone. They told me later that there had been a string of robberies in the area and the people doing it worked in groups. One of them would gain the homeowner's trust while the others waited outside to ambush them. The officers said I was lucky I got away, because those groups don't usually leave witnesses. I moved out of that house a month later. Even now, I double-check all my locks and never, ever open the door to someone I don't know. The scariest part is thinking about how easily I let her in, how close I came to, well, I don't even want to think about it. All it would have taken was one wrong move, 1 second slower at that back door, and I don't know if I'd even be here to share my story. I moved into this house about 6 months ago, wanting a fresh start. It's a cozy single-story place in Texas. Not big, but perfect for me, especially after years of cramped apartments. I'm 27, and this is my first time living completely alone. The neighborhood seems safe, quiet, with a mix of families and older couples. People kept to themselves, but waved politely when they saw me. It felt like a good place to settle in and have some peace. The first couple of months were mostly uneventful. I was still getting used to the silence, though. Every creak and groan of the house would startle me at night. I told myself it was just the house settling, the kind of thing you notice more when there's no one else around to distract you. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was always on edge, like I was hyper-aware of everything around me. One Friday morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a knock at the door. It startled me because I wasn't expecting anyone, and deliveries usually came later in the afternoon. I walked to the door, cautiously looking through the peephole. Standing on my porch was a man I didn't recognize. He was probably in his mid-40s, with a scruffy beard, a dirty baseball cap, and a worn-out flannel shirt. He had a toolbox in one hand and a clipboard in the other. I cracked the door open just a bit, keeping the chain lock on. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Morning," he said, giving me a smile that felt forced. "I'm here to check the pipes under your sink. The previous owner sent me. Said there might be an issue with the plumbing." My stomach dropped. This didn't make sense. I'd rented the house and the landlord had never mentioned anything about repairs. "I think you have the wrong house," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. No, he said quickly. "This is the right place. He told me to stop by today." I hesitated. Something about the way he was talking didn't sit right with me. He was too confident, like he expected me to just let him in without question. "What's the landlord's name?" I asked. The man paused for a split second, just long enough for me to notice before saying, Mr. Thompson. That wasn't my landlord's name. "I'm sorry," I said, starting to close the door. "I don't think you're supposed to be here." Before I could shut it completely, his hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the door. "Look, ma'am, I'm just here to do my job," he said, his tone sharp now, the fake smile gone. My heart was pounding. "I'm calling my landlord to check," I told him, hoping that would make him back off. Instead, his grip tightened on the door. His expression changed completely, his eyes narrowing into something cold and mean. "You don't need to do that," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Just let me in. I'll be done in 10 minutes. I slammed the door shut with all my strength and locked it, my hands shaking. He started pounding on the door, yelling something I couldn't understand. I grabbed my phone and called 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what was happening. The operator stayed on the line with me while I waited for the police. It felt like forever before I heard the sound of sirens. When the officers arrived, the man was gone. They took my statement and looked around the property, but they didn't find much, just a cigarette butt near the driveway and some muddy footprints leading to the street. I thought that was the end of it. I wanted to believe he'd just been some random guy looking for an easy target and that I'd scared him off. But 2 nights later, something happened that made me realize this wasn't over. It was late, maybe 1 a.m., and I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone. I had left the blinds on my bedroom window slightly open to let in some light from the street lamp outside. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was just the shadows of the tree branches swaying in the wind, but then I saw it again, this time unmistakable. Someone was standing outside my window. I froze. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Slowly, I turned my head to look, hoping I was imagining things. But I wasn't. It was him, the same man from the other day. He was standing just a few feet from my window, staring in. His face was partially lit by the street lamp, and he wasn't moving, just watching me. I scrambled for my phone, dialing 911 again with shaking hands. I didn't even bother whispering to the operator this time. "He's here," I said, my voice trembling. "The guy from before. He's outside my window." The operator told me to stay on the line and keep quiet, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. He didn't move, even when I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. It wasn't until the flashing lights came into view that he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The police searched the area but didn't find him. They did, however, find cigarette butts and more footprints near the fence in my backyard. It was clear he'd been watching me for a while. A week later, they caught him. He'd broken into another woman's house a few streets over. She managed to escape and call the police, and they finally arrested him. When the officer came to update me, he said something I'll never forget. "You're lucky you called us when you did. This guy's been targeting women living alone. He's already wanted for multiple assaults in other counties." I moved out a month later. I couldn't stay in that house, knowing he'd been watching me, knowing how close I'd come to being another victim. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me whenever I'm home alone. I double-check every lock and window before going to bed, and I keep a knife on my nightstand. Living alone was supposed to be freeing, but now it just feels like I'm waiting for something bad to happen. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I'm a 29-year-old software engineer living alone in a modest 2-bedroom house in Austin, Texas. My job keeps me busy, and I often find myself working late into the night, glued to my computer screen, coding or answering emails. I'm used to the quiet, but I'm also no stranger to a little bit of paranoia. Living alone can do that to you. I've had my fair share of creepy experiences in the past, but nothing prepared me for the night that would completely shake me to my core. It was a Thursday night, the kind of night where the city hums quietly in the background, almost peaceful, but there's always an undercurrent of tension, like something's just waiting to happen. The house felt empty. It's been this way since my roommate moved out a few months ago. I got used to being on my own, but I'll admit, sometimes the silence feels too loud. I was sitting on the couch, trying to relax after a long day of work. My laptop was open on the coffee table, and I was half watching a documentary on Netflix when I heard it. A loud knock at the front door. I jumped, startled. It was just past midnight. Nobody ever knocked at my door this late. For a second, I thought it might be some sort of mistake. Maybe someone had the wrong house. Maybe it was just a kid playing a prank. But as the seconds ticked by, I realized I wasn't going to be able to ignore it. My heart was pounding now, and my instincts told me something was off. I hesitated. My mind raced. Should I just ignore it? Maybe it was someone who needed help. Or maybe it was someone trying to pull some scam. Either way, I wasn't about to open the door without knowing who was on the other side. I slowly got up and crept toward the door. I peered through the peephole. There was a man standing outside, looking down at the ground, his hands in the pockets of his hoodie. He looked like he was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. His face was scruffy, like he hadn't shaved in days, and he looked tired. Too tired. His clothes were worn, a bit dirty, but not necessarily ragged. Something about him seemed off. I took a deep breath and called out through the door, "Who is it?" He looked up and immediately gave me a weak smile. "Hey, I'm really sorry to bother you. My car broke down a couple of blocks away, and I was wondering if I could use your phone to call for help." I looked at the man, trying to size him up. His voice sounded polite enough, but there was a sense of urgency in his tone. I could tell he was trying to sound calm, but there was something about him that felt wrong. I hesitated. "Sorry, but I don't think I can help you. There's a gas station down the street. They might have a phone you can use." The man didn't move. He stayed standing there, his hands still in his pockets. For a moment, I thought he might walk away, but instead he leaned in closer to the door, his voice lower now. "Please, I've been walking for a while, and I'm really not feeling well. I just need to make one quick call. It won't take long. I'm not asking for a ride or anything like that." I could hear the desperation in his voice now, but it only made me more suspicious. Why hadn't he gone to the gas station? It was only a 10-minute walk, and there were plenty of other houses along the way. Why come here? I felt my pulse quicken. I didn't want to be rude, but my gut was screaming at me not to open the door. "I'm really sorry," I said, trying to sound firm, "but I can't help you." There was a long pause. For a moment, I thought the man might give up and leave. But then, I heard him mutter something under his breath, almost like he was talking to himself. "Come on, just let me in." I felt a chill run down my spine. Before I could even process what had just happened, the doorknob rattled. It was subtle at first, but then it happened again, this time harder. My heart leapt in my chest as I backed away from the door. I could hear the man's breathing, heavy and ragged, just on the other side. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I could find, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My phone was on the coffee table, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the door. I called 911, whispering into the phone, "There's someone trying to break in. Please send someone. I'm scared." I could still hear the man outside, now pressing his weight against the door. He was trying to force it open. The lock creaked as the man slammed into the door with his shoulder. I stepped back, holding the knife with both hands, my eyes darting between the door and the window. I could barely think straight. My entire body was shaking. Then I heard it. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" It was Mr. Clark, my neighbor across the street. He was standing on his porch, yelling at the man outside. Mr. Clark is an older guy, probably in his late 60s. And while he's not exactly the type to get involved in other people's business, his voice was loud enough to make the guy pause. The man outside stopped banging on the door. I heard footsteps running away, and then silence. A few minutes later, the police arrived. I explained everything, still trembling from the adrenaline. They searched the area and found the man hiding in a backyard a few houses down. He had a knife in his pocket. The officer told me I did the right thing by not opening the door. Apparently, this guy had been seen lurking around the neighborhood earlier that day. He wasn't looking for help. He was looking for a victim. I've since upgraded my locks and installed a security camera, but even now, months later, I still get chills every time I hear a knock at my door after dark. That night reminded me how quickly a quiet, ordinary evening can turn into something straight out of a nightmare. It was a Tuesday evening, pretty uneventful at first. I'd just finished my dinner, the sun had already set, and the only light in the room was from the TV. Outside, it was pitch black. My backyard doesn't have any streetlights nearby, and the woods at the back make it even darker. Around 8 p.m., everything suddenly went dark. A power outage wasn't completely unheard of, but it wasn't common either. I groaned, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. I figured I'd check the breaker box to see if it was just my house or the whole neighborhood. But as I stood up, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A light. A beam of light moving through my backyard. I froze. My heart started racing as I stared at the window. The beam moved slowly, almost like whoever was holding it was scanning the yard. I live alone, and my backyard is fenced. No one should have been there. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor, but that didn't make sense. Why would they be in my yard? I crouched down by the window, trying to stay out of sight, and peeked through the corner of the curtain. My hands were already shaking, but what I saw made it worse. There was a man out there. He was wearing a dark hoodie, and he had a flashlight in one hand and something else in the other. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but when he moved closer to the back door, the light caught it. It was a crowbar. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just some lost guy wandering through. He was here for a reason. I ducked down and crawled to the other side of the room where my phone was. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight, but I managed to call 911. I whispered to the operator that there was someone in my backyard with a crowbar. She stayed calm, which helped me calm down a little too. She told me to find a safe place to hide and stay on the line. I decided to hide in the bathroom. It's in the middle of the house with no windows, and it has a lock on the door. I crept down the hallway as quietly as I could. My phone flashlight pointed at the floor to avoid drawing attention. Every step felt impossibly loud. When I reached the bathroom, I closed the door gently and locked it. I turned off the flashlight and sat down in the tub, trying to control my breathing. The operator kept talking to me, asking for updates. I whispered back, telling her everything I could hear. And then I heard it. The sound of glass breaking. My blood went ice cold. He had smashed one of the windows. I didn't know which one, but it didn't matter. He was inside. The operator told me to stay calm and stay hidden. She said the police were on their way, but it felt like they'd never get here in time. I could hear his footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the house. I held my breath, trying not to make a single sound. The footsteps got closer. He was checking each room, one by one. I could hear him opening doors, moving things around. The worst part was how calm he seemed. Like he wasn't in a rush. Like he knew he had time. I was sure he was going to find me. I gripped my phone so tight my fingers started to cramp. Every second felt like an hour. Then I heard voices outside, shouting. The police had arrived. There was a loud bang, and the man started running. I heard a door slam, more shouting, and then what sounded like a struggle. I stayed in the tub, too scared to move, until one of the officers knocked on the bathroom door and told me it was safe to come out. When I stepped out, I saw the man handcuffed on the floor in my living room. He was lying face down, and his hoodie had been pulled back. He looked ordinary. Not like some dangerous criminal, but that somehow made it worse. The police told me he was a known burglar who had been targeting homes in the area. They said I was lucky I had called when I did. If I had tried to confront him or run, things could have ended very differently. I've never felt the same in my house since that night. I've added locks, cameras, and motion lights, but none of it makes me feel completely safe. I still jump at every little noise, and I can't sit in the dark anymore without panicking. This was my home, my safe place, but now it feels like I'm just waiting for something else to happen. I thought this kind of thing only happened in movies, or to other people. Now I know better. I've always loved living alone. There's a sense of independence, of peace, that comes from having your own space. I moved into a small one-bedroom house in Plano, Texas, about a year ago. It wasn't much, but it was affordable, cozy, and quiet. Just what I needed after my last messy breakup. The neighborhood wasn't fancy, but it was safe enough. Or at least, that's what I thought. It started about 2 months after I moved in. It was a Tuesday night, and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. The day had been uneventful. Work, dinner, a quick jog around the block. And I was trying to unwind before sleeping. My bedroom window faced the side yard where I'd planted a few bushes that were mostly dead from neglect. The window was always shut, and the blinds were drawn because I liked the privacy. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, or maybe the neighbor's cat wandering around. But as I listened, the sound became clearer. Slow, heavy footsteps, crunching on the dry leaves outside my window. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was deliberate, too heavy to be an animal, and too slow to be the wind. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped just beneath the window. I stared at the blinds, half expecting someone to yank them open from the other side, but nothing happened. After a minute or so, the footsteps moved away, fading into the night. I told myself it was probably just a passerby cutting through the yard, even though I knew how unlikely that was. The next morning, I checked the yard for any signs of someone being there. The grass was trampled in a few spots, and some of the bushes looked like they'd been brushed against, but there wasn't anything that screamed danger. I shook it off and went about my day, but the footsteps came back. The next night, around the same time, I was in bed when I heard them again. This time, they lasted longer. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving back and forth outside the window like someone was pacing. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to stop. When it finally did, I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? "Hi, I think someone might be walking around my yard?" It sounded ridiculous. I convinced myself it was probably nothing, and forced myself to go to sleep. By the third night, I was on edge. I didn't want to go to bed, but staying up all night wasn't an option either. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., the footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop outside the window. They moved to the back of the house. I heard the gate creak open, followed by the same slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the grass. My throat went dry. I didn't have the courage to look outside, so I just sat there in the dark, gripping my phone like it was a lifeline. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped, and I eventually fell asleep, though it was fitful at best. Over the next week, the footsteps became a regular occurrence. Sometimes they'd stay by the window. Other times, they'd circle the house, slow and deliberate, like someone was scoping the place out. I started double-checking all the locks on the doors and windows before bed, but it didn't make me feel any safer. One night, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the blinds. It was quick, just a flicker of movement, but it was enough to send me into a panic. I sat there, clutching the kitchen knife I'd brought to bed with me, too scared to even breathe. The shadow didn't come back, and I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I had just started to let my guard down, thinking maybe whoever it was had gotten bored and moved on. I was wrong. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of my window rattling. First, I thought it was the wind, but then I saw the blinds move. Someone was trying to open the window. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't move. I just stared at the window as the rattling continued. Then I saw it. A hand, pale and dirty, reaching through the small gap at the bottom of the window. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The hand fumbled around, trying to unlock the window from the inside. I finally snapped out of it and let out a blood-curdling scream. The hand froze. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard hurried footsteps as the person outside took off. I scrambled to turn on the light and grab my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was long gone. They searched the yard and found footprints leading from the window to the back gate, which had been left wide open. The officer told me to be more vigilant and consider installing cameras. To this day, I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I can't shake the feeling that they weren't just there to scare me. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. After that night, I became more cautious. I installed security cameras around the house, reinforced the locks on every door and window, and even made sure I always had my phone within reach. But even with all the extra precautions, the fear still lingers. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.